Our panel today includes Sarah Blake and Jennifer Klepper. Sarah is a New York Times best-selling author of The Grange House and The Postmistress. Her new book is The Guest Book, and it is an epic multi-generational story featuring an old money New York City family that unfolds at their summer island in Maine. The book explores family history and how unspoken secrets and prejudice are buried in family traditions and expectations that influence 3 generations of the Milton family. Ms. Blake has also authored a book of poems called Full Turn and The Runaway Girl, which is an artist book. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and her 2 children. Also on the panel today is Jennifer Klepper, and her book, Unbroken Threads, also explores issues of race in the context of family history. While Midwest native, Ms. Klepper has come to her senses and is now settled in Annapolis, Maryland, with her husband and her 2 children. And she attended Southwestern Methodist University and the University of Virginia School of Law. Her legal experience is definitely on display in her book Unbroken Threads, as the book's main character is a lawyer turned stay-home mother who is struggling to return to the workforce. And she does this by volunteering to represent a Syrian woman immigrating to the United States. The book is set in Annapolis and Baltimore, so there's some very familiar places to those of us who are Marylanders. And it also addresses issues of immigration, prejudice, not only to the community, but the main character has to struggle with those issues in herself and with her family. So like the themes in the guest book, Unbroken Threads explores the connections that transcend generations and cultures. And I found that both books, for me, raised issues with my own family history and how that history colored who I am in my experiences. Now, moderating today's panel is Hannah Oliver Depp. She is the owner of Loyalty Bookstores in Petworth, D.C., with a forthcoming new store in Silver Spring, Maryland. Oh, yeah. She is a career bookseller who managed Word bookstores in Brooklyn, New York, and Jersey City, New Jersey, and also Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. So please welcome the panel today.
Thank you all so much for joining us today and surviving. You have made it to the humid panel. I am very excited to talk about both of these. Now, I was delighted and somewhat amused that kind of our header was book clubs, and book club topics. I'm curious in the audience, who's in a book club? How many of your book clubs have wine? How many are just in a wine club and there's a book somewhere nearby? No, it is one of the things as a bookseller that we get this question constantly. And it's like, what should my book club read? Do you have suggestions for my book club? It's so fun because people often come back and then they tell you what the book club said, which is almost more entertaining. But I'm going to toss that question to you guys, actually. First of all, what makes a great book club book?
Do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm in a couple of different book clubs, and actually when I wrote my book, I had my own book club in mind the whole time, because the best books that we discuss are the ones that keep us talking late into the night about issues that we don't normally talk about with each other. They raise questions of moral choices, characters who are unlikable in different ways to different people, and are stories that are discussed by people coming from different backgrounds who read a story in a different way from everyone else in the room, and that generates the discussion. So for me, a book club book is one that presents characters and issues that can be seen from different viewpoints in different ways, that thereby generate discussion that allow the members of the book club to learn not only more about themselves, but more about their friends and the others in the group.
I mean, I would definitely second that. But then also, one of the things I love is, when you read a really good book that you've been completely immersed in, like you've lost your life, your world around you. And then, you come back up to the surface, and there's that thing of like, oh my God, I have to talk about this immediately. I have to go find somebody, who has also, or like, did they also do that deep dive? I mean, that sense of like real immersion in the kind of privacy, the great privacy of your own head of reading, but then, emerging into a group. And I'm not in a book group, but I mean, I do have that sense of like when I've just finished something, I feel like I want to go on the street and be like, okay, has anybody read this? Because and so I think that's like one of the most sort of potent things about book groups or just, gatherings around books, because you get to cross out of the private into the way in which, books do that magic thing where, I mean, we're sitting here up here, we've finished our books. You are there. Many of you are writers and readers also, but like, so here it's real. This is what makes it real. We're here talking, words are with us.
Yeah, if you do that often enough, you can just come to my store and be a bookseller. It's fine. It's great. Yeah, I mean, that is the great pleasure. You just get to be like, everyone has to read this book.
I know,
'cause I
right
loved it.
now.
Right now. I do really feel that, and I think that there's a lot to talk about and to unpack in both of your books, but I think one of the places that they overlap is that there's so much of the bigger world in your books. They're almost, it's like pounding on the walls of the book, right? There's the Great War, there's our current war, there's so many huge scoping things, and yet they're deeply personal and very intimate. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about, juxtaposing intimate portrayals of people against huge world circumstances.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the guest book is as Joan said, a multi-generational novel, and it very much. I was ready at the time I started to write it to kind of interrogate my own position in what James Baldwin has called. I mean, when he said this amazing sentence, which is over my desk and is actually one of the epigraphs here. Yeah. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I wanted to write a family novel, so focus on, on the sort of small, but I really wanted to take on, this was sort of 2008, 2009, as Obama was running and then becoming president. I wanted to enter the conversation about race that seemed to be coming onto the surface, and I really wanted to interrogate my position in relation to Baldwin's trap. And so that idea of history inside us collapses between the sort of small, the private, and then the larger world outside. In some ways, I was trying to do what Woolf did with The Years, where she's telling the history of an England over 100 years, but very much through the particulars of people and families, and the way that families pass on their secrets and create false myths because they're half told. Seems a great way to think about this country in particular, the way we have passed on our kind of collective history, and especially our racial history. So I was sort of overtly eliding the two.
Mm-hmm. That's something I thought a lot about when I was writing my book. So mine addresses a woman coming from Syria into the United States and seeking asylum. And I was writing this before the election, the 2016 election, and the timeliness of it when it came out last year was quite a surprise for me. But at the time, I was thinking a lot about what we see on TV and what we were hearing on the news about what's going on, and it's this sort of monolithic presentation. There's atrocities happening in Syria, and we think we're presenting this group of people leaving their country, leaving their homes, and it's hard to connect to that if you're not connecting to an individual. And so in my book, what I looked at was the possibility of this one American woman connecting with this one Syrian woman, and how that can change the mind of one person, and how that then can sort of flow outward from the one person, and how important it is to hear each story, because each story is different. And it's interesting, I attended a book club at your store just the other day, and it was the Heads of the Colored People, which is a collection of short stories. And one of the things that I really loved about that is that although it was a book about race in a great part, every story presented a different voice, sort of showing that there's not one voice. it's important to hear many voices because we can't look at any group of people or any community as having one sense of being, and connecting on a personal level is the only way that we can really make change in the greater sense that you're talking about. So that's sort of the big to the small, back to the big again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, please.
The great German writer Erich Maria Remarque has this wonderful line where he says, the trouble is the imagination cannot count. So you can say 6 million people died in the Holocaust, but that tells you nothing. And he sort of brings it down. He said, but I can tell you about one man who was questioned in the rain one afternoon, and goes on, and that might tell you about what it was. And it's exactly what you're saying, that notion of giving it not just a story, but an actual situation, bringing it to one. Yeah.
And absolutely, and that's the power of the novel, right?
Yeah.
Because you invite the world into your living room through its pages. Jennifer, it's a present global conflict. It's in our feeds. It's on the television. It's everything. But I was really struck with the way that she sort of first personally encounters it as a lawyer and has to do some research and then feels it in a totally different way. Do you mind reading a passage from your book?
Sure. Okay, so where we are here on chapter 7 is the main character, Jessica, has taken on the asylum case for Amina. Now, Jessica is pro bono. She's had very little training, which is a real thing for pro bono attorneys, and she realizes she needs to learn about Syria. She needs to learn about what's happening in Syria, and she's picked up a couple of boxes full of files and research from the nonprofit that's supporting her. This isn't enough. Jessica slammed the folder shut, creating an unsatisfyingly weak whoosh when she would have preferred a loud slap. Gracie, ears pricked, looked up at Jessica from the rug in front of the fireplace. Realizing Jessica wasn't offering food or a walk, she rearranged herself, pulling the rug here and there into a proper dog's nest, and went back to sleep. Jessica had cleaned up the impressive taco mess her youngest had left in the kitchen and now sat curled into the corner of the couch with her laptop, paging through Amina's thin application and typing notes. Unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, Amina's application read the way Amina spoke, clipped and devoid of detail, guarded. To be fair, considering the debacle with Amina's first lawyer and the fact that asylum applications have to be filed within 1 year of entry into the U.S., it was likely that Amina had prepared the application in haste to beat the deadline. Jessica clicked on the browser tab that displayed the asylum laws text. Amina had to approve that she could not return to Syria due to persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. It was one thing to learn about this in a short training session, but another to apply the rule to a woman's story. And then I'm skipping ahead. After pouring another cup of coffee, Jessica returned to her computer, scrolling through photo after photo of bombed Syrian cities. I might cry, just by the way.
Yeah. Okay. Do you like me to read?
I'm surprised.
It's really it's really passionate. Yeah.
Well, I did when I was doing the research myself.
Yeah.
I have this problem. My book launch, I bawled.
This is not a problem. This is feeling. It's good.
It's not even an emotional scene. It's a presentation of facts. Okay. Buildings in Amina's hometown of Aleppo stood exposed, whole walls peeled away. She wanted to look into each shell of a building. I'm a mess. I'm sorry.
You are not. I think what you're actually illustrating is there's such a huge difference from the overwhelming wash of it, and then when you take time to individually look at it and you associate it with a person. And it's such there's such moving passages in the book, but there's parts where she's being factual. She's being a lawyer. She's just gathering information, which is exactly what's happening here. But what happens later in the book is it becomes associated with Amina, becomes associated with this person. And, at first I couldn't quite figure out why they were like, it's a book club book. And, and I was like, but it is, because it draws you in. It really draws you into the personal and then pulls it back out again, like Sarah was saying.
I think I can finish it now.
Go for it.
Okay. Buildings in Amina's hometown of Aleppo stood exposed, whole walls peeled away. She wanted to look into each shell of a building, peek around every corner, and flag down each of the poor souls wandering through the wreckage. Clicking on one image led to another, and eventually the concrete shelves gave way to bloodied bodies twisted from torture. Bloated heads lined up on poles, and kneeling men facing away from the guns held up to their heads. All of these recent atrocities stemmed from protests over the regime's treatment of some young people who spray-painted anti-regime graffiti on the walls of their school. Spray paint. Millions of refugees. Settling back into her corner of the couch, Jessica felt chastened and small, something this case was beginning to make common. Leaving her own home in Iowa had seemed so monumental, so brave, a small-town girl going out into the big world. That and feeling for years as though she could not go back seemed trivial now, though the damage had been done. But this wasn't about her. Jessica picked up Amina's application and studied the woman who fit into this history in her own way, and who now had to prove a basis for her fear in order to stay in America, using an attorney who had just learned where Syria was on a map. Okay. Well then.
I think the book does a really good job addressing, I mean, I think we are all her at some point where we just feel overwhelmed and we just sit back. And what's fascinating is to watch what happens next, because that's often where we all stop, right?
Yeah.
And so she's staying involved. And I think I had so many questions where I felt like I could sit down, that this was someone I worked with, someone I knew.
Yeah.
She was so familiar, especially if you're in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. You know, these are familiar professions, these are familiar stories. And I, you know, what is the thing? Like, do you want to have a beer with that person? But I was like, I feel like I could have a glass of wine with this woman and talk to her for hours. What was it, you know, what was this character like writing for you? How intimate was it for you to write this character?
Well, this character derives a lot from me in many ways, and I'm always asked that, and she's not me. Mm-hmm. But I was corporate attorney, same as her, from small town Iowa, same as Jessica, and so I know her, mm-hmm. But I was not an immigration attorney. I have not represented an asylum seeker, and so I basically took this shell of a character and decided to put her in a situation that was outside of her comfort zone at a time in her life when she needed to be outside of her comfort zone in order to find out what her next role in life was going to be. And as part of that, I got to learn a lot, and I think that was one of the things I loved the most about writing this book is how much I got to learn. And I think that's why I got so emotional reading it, because when I was researching it, I often had to stop because what I was learning was so, it just touched me so much, and that really took the book where it went. So it was quite a process.
Can I? Please, I was going to actually ask a follow-up question too. Go for it.
Well, no, because I think that also feeling so kind of aligned to that when, as you're creating these worlds that you're trying to understand, the ways in which, like, the sort of, how the imagination takes you so unexpectedly into places you didn't know were in you. I mean, these kinds of tears, I feel like, are part of, like, when you're just sitting, when you're trying to imagine, you're imagining it like so physically, like, you know, all the way, and it's, I mean, you know, it's so recognizable that again, how do you bear what you actually are trying to bring to life?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you've had to do some research into a lot of atrocities as well, and I think that you've had to come very close to inhumanity, and it's hard sometimes. Did you struggle with that at all?
Yeah, and I mean, definitely, and even in the smallest way, like trying to imagine, I mean, you know, in this book, there's a child who dies. I mean, like, what I'm thinking is, like, how if you follow your imagination all the way to the actual making of the scene, you've really had to go, you know, you've had to go all the way and feel it, you know, through. So, I mean, even if it's going through facts or just, I mean, I feel like this is the kind of, it's not an occupational hazard, but it is something that is, like, in some ways shocking. Mm-hmm. Like, your imagination ambushes you, and you're so acutely in it, you know, all the way. Yeah.
It was literally my next question, was just thinking about the amount of research that you both, I'm sure, had to pour in this, and how do you let it not overwhelm you personally as you're trying to write and create and leave room for your imagination to grow, but also, how do you write a novel that's taking place in the present day, and there's big cultural moments happening in your book, Jennifer, and then Sarah, you've got a ton of history in your book, the 3 generations, and how do you let that not overwhelm the narrative? How does it not become a spool of facts instead of a story about people?
I'll let you answer
Well,
this.
I think that, that is the dance, and especially of, historical fiction, which I always put in quotes because in some ways all fiction is historical, where, it's a narration of, something. But I think that the dance between the essential building of a credible universe, a plausible reality, because you can't go with me to 1936 if, the person is wearing culottes or whatever it is, like the anachronistic, but even the ways in which they speak. And I think that in order then to give, the fictional dream of a time, the research has to be ironclad and it has to disappear. And I mean, for me, one of the ways that actually all my novels, the research I've done has been very much reading the books, the magazines, the journals, the poems of the time period that I'm in, because I really feel like the diction is the way in, so, and I love also just wrapping, language around me like a cloak and then, moving forward. I mean, when I was writing The Postmistress, I started to do, say things like, hello, beauty. I mean, just like crazy, things. And that's fun. I mean, that's good.
Yeah.
It's interesting because to hear what you were reading from the time, because one of my sources for research was following blogs of people in Syria and people who were refugees who had fled Syria, watching YouTube videos that they had posted, and reading other materials that they were putting out electronically. So that would be the modern day equivalent of what you were reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's almost an infinite amount of source material, and yet you still have to pare it down into fitting into the story, or rather the story and it kind of have to merge.
But I think then, the story then, so you create the world, but then it's the characters who lead you, I think. I mean, for me, it's always been somebody will do something in my head, and I'll be like, what was that? And, or somebody will arrive, and I will have created the world, but why is that person there, and now what am I going to do? So, and then that's where the story seems to go for me anyway.
And I just have one more question before we open it up to the floor. Sarah, would you read the prologue for your book?
Sure.
And I'm just so fascinated with the way that the present day and the past hit each other in this book.
Yeah. So this is the way the novel begins. It's the usual story, the man at the tiller reflected, regarding the beautiful derelict on the hill. At the end of old money, there is real estate. There were 3 of them in the boat that Saturday in June. They had set out from Rockland, Maine, on a day's sail into the bay, and tacking into a cove of one of the many granite islands 8 or 9 miles offshore, had come face to face with the great white house before them, some sea captain's pride, sitting squarely on top of a long lawn leading down to a boathouse and dock. The house needed paint. The lawn needed cutting. The boathouse roofline sagged and the shingles slipped. Empty of boats, the dock in front of them had been patched and patched again. It was magnificent. I'm waiting for it to go up for sale, the host of the weekend went on. Low-hanging fruit. Whose is it? The man sitting beside him asked. One of those families who used to run the world. The host stretched his legs, pressing his bare feet against the boat's hull. It was warm. Wasps. Wasps, the other chuckled. Do they even exist anymore except in their own heads? The host smiled. He had just made a fortune in health care. What happened? The man beside him asked. The usual, I'd suspect. Drinking, apathy, dullards in the gene pool. What's their name? Dunno. He jimmied the boom. Milton? The Miltons? Milton? The third man, the man in the bow, who'd been staring up at the house all this while, turned around. As in Milton, Higginson and Company, the bankers? Sounds right, answered the host, pulling the mainsail in so the wind caught, sending them on an angle out of the cove and back into the channel, running with the wind along the coastline of the island. The sailors fell into a companionable silence, punctuated by the hosts ready about and heartily calling them to shift their weight from one side of the Herreshoff to the other, leaving room for the boom to sail unchecked over their heads. "It's one of those tragic families," he said, as they reached the end of the island's granite spine. "They say somebody drowned there." "Where?" "Just there, off those rocks." He pointed to a mound of white granite boulders humped high above the waterline, backed by a ridge of spruce rising into the sky. There was nothing to see. "Ready about," the man at the tiller said, and they tacked away.
I have about 30 more questions, but I would like to share that with all of you. Do you guys have any questions? We can bring the mic around for you, just so everyone can hear in the space. Cool, so we've got 2, all right. Thank you. And the green top and then the stripes.
I have a lot, but I'll just ask, did you go to the sites that you're writing about? Did you actually go to Syria? Do you know the coast of Maine because you've been there? Because I've been to Maine and you just evoked it beautifully.
I have not been to Syria. I don't know that I even could have if I had wanted to.
And yes, Maine is very familiar to me. I have grown up going to Maine. Yeah. That.
That was actually sort of my question too, except I was going to frame it in terms of why did you choose to set your stories in these places? And then what's something that you particularly loved about the setting once you dove into it?
My setting is in Annapolis and Baltimore, and that is where I live, so it's something I knew and an area that I really love, and it fit my characters. I also was able to, I spent some time at the Catholic Charities in Baltimore to learn about how they work with refugees, and so it was just a great place to set something that I had already connected with the lawyers up there and learned how they worked with the community.
And my novel moves between Manhattan and this island in Maine. And since I was really trying to think about these families that have basically considered themselves the sort of hosts of the country, their whole, since the Mayflower, owning an island which sets up immediately its own kind of mythology was too sort of perfect a metaphor for it to really have most of the novel takes place, alternating between the island of Manhattan and the island in Maine, and what the island represents, who's in it, who's not. So the more I used it, also it was a place I knew very well. I mean, Maine is what in some ways spawned my imagination. My imagination is sparked by that coastline, and so it was sort of the conversation between that.
Time for one more question. Please. Yeah.
What's your biggest challenge in writing a novel?
What's the biggest challenge in writing a novel? The novel?
Yeah.
Butt in chair, I suppose. I think butt in chair.
Yeah.
For me, it's competing responsibilities, competing desires. I'm learning better to schedule everything around writing instead of scheduling writing around everything else. I get better writing done if I kick off the day with the writing and then deal with all the rest of the stuff later, as opposed to what I was doing before, which was writing would just get shoved off to the side. But your books they take a long time.
They take a really long time. It is writing the novel, and I think, so this one took 8 years. The Postmistress took 10. Part of that is because I do start with a character, and I kind of then follow them or her or him. And, you can go down many fantastic rabbit holes and, follow it, and then you realize, oh, no, that's not going to do what I want it to do, and sort of pull back. I think my trouble is I'm writing horizontally rather than, narratively, and I think my great aim is to try and actually start at the beginning on, June 1st or whatever, and get to maybe the end, 2 years later. But I seem to not be able to do anything like that.
Yeah.
So,
Write around and then see what world you've got.
yeah, exactly.
Well, my final question for you all is, assuming that these will be as wonderful book club reads as we seem to suspect they will be, what do you hope is the question that a book club asks when they read your book, or what do you hope someone takes out of it when they read your book?
Since I really do feel like this for me, the book was about coming to see, the ground under your feet, coming to see your face in the mirror, and as as a member of this country and of a family. And I think the question is, what once you come to see, what do you do? And I think that would be what I would love to hear a book club, so having come to the end, like, so, okay, now what? Now where are we,
Yeah.
I like the idea of sharing stories, and I think that was the heart of my book, was the power of stories to tie us together and to tie us to generations past, people we've never even met, but whose stories we carry either within us or in family heirlooms and that sort of thing, which show up in my book. And so that's one of the things that I've loved to see book clubs talk about, is the stories that have connected them and things that are special in their own families, and the way they've met people who are unlike themselves or from backgrounds unlike their own, on an individual basis, much like the characters in my book. So, to me, that theme is one that resonates with me, and so I love to see that with the readers as well.
Well, thank you all so much. Please join me in giving Jennifer and Sarah a hand. It was wonderful.